Edward II of England. On September 21, 1327, 43-year-old Edward II sat alone in a cell at Berkeley Castle, stripped of his crown for 8 months. He had ruled England for 20 years and lost almost all of it: his barons, his armies, his queen. He lost Scotland at Bannockburn, handed power to royal favorites, and drove his own nobles to rebellion. His own wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer had seized him and locked him away. He was the first English king to be formally deposed, and no one in power had any interest in keeping him alive. 2 men entered his cell that night: Thomas Gurney and William Ogle. They pinned a large wooden board down over his body. Edward fought back. The struggle knocked furniture across the stone floor. 2 guards held his legs flat against the ground. Within minutes, it was over. They needed him dead but unmarked, a corpse that could be shown to the public without raising questions. A hollow horn was pressed against his body. A red-hot iron was driven through it. His internal injuries left no trace on his skin. The cell showed no blood. The body showed no wounds. His corpse was dressed, arranged, and displayed publicly for 30 days afterward to prove he had died of natural causes. Nobody could prove otherwise. The man who lost Scotland at Bannockburn died in a way no surgeon could explain to a crowd. Louis XVI. On January 21, 1793, 38-year-old Louis XVI rode in a green carriage through Paris for 70 minutes, surrounded by 1,200 armed guards. He had been King of France for 18 years before the revolution stripped him of his power, then his title, and finally even his name. He had inherited a kingdom drowning in debt, failed to reform it, and when his own people rose up against the monarchy, he tried to flee the country in disguise. He was caught at the border and brought back to Paris in chains. The guillotine, a tall wooden frame with a heavy angled blade used for executions, was still new in Paris. The carriage stopped at the Place de la Révolution. Louis stepped out and tried to address the crowd. A drum roll began immediately and drowned out his voice. Guards grabbed him and walked him up the steps of the scaffold. He was strapped to a tilting board and locked flat. The board dropped horizontal. The lunette closed around his neck. The blade fell from approximately 2.3 meters and severed his head in under 1 second. An executioner's assistant carried the head to each corner of the scaffold and held it out toward the crowd. The crowd shouted "Vive la République" for several minutes. Marie Antoinette followed him to the same machine 9 months later. Charles I of England. On January 30, 1649, 48-year-old Charles I stepped through a first-floor window of the banqueting house in London onto a wooden scaffold built at chest height. He was the first English monarch to be put on trial by his own parliament and found guilty of treason. He had dissolved parliament twice, raised taxes without its consent, and fought a civil war against his own people to keep his grip on power. 59 judges signed his death warrant. The execution was public, deliberate, and unprecedented, a statement that no king was above the law. Charles wore 2 shirts that cold morning so the crowd would not mistake shivering for fear. He tucked his long hair under a white cap. He knelt and placed his neck on the block himself. He spread his arms flat to signal he was ready. The axe came down in a single stroke. The executioner lifted the severed head and held it up to the crowd. A witness recorded that thousands of people let out a single low groan, not cheering, just a sound no one present had ever heard before. Parliament banned any publication that called him a martyr. Within 11 years, his son sat on the same throne. Richard III. On August 22, 1485, 32-year-old Richard III rode out from his position on a hill at the Battle of Bosworth Field and pointed his horse directly at Henry Tudor. He led a cavalry charge of roughly 100 knights straight at the enemy commander, a strategy that would have ended the battle in minutes if it had worked. The Stanleys watched from the sidelines, a powerful, noble family with 6,000 men who had not committed to either side. Both armies had been waiting for their decision. At that moment, the Stanley riders turned and charged toward Henry's lines. Richard's cavalry was surrounded on 3 sides. His horse became stuck in marshy ground. Richard was pulled from his horse and struck by multiple weapons simultaneously. Forensic analysis of his skeleton, found beneath a Leicester car park in 2012, identified 11 separate wounds, 9 of them to the skull. His body was stripped naked, thrown over a horse, and displayed for 2 days. He was the last English king to die in battle. Basil I. In August 886, 74-year-old Byzantine Emperor Basil I rode out alone into the forest near his imperial hunting lodge outside Constantinople. He had ruled the Byzantine Empire for 19 years after murdering his way to the throne, including killing his own co-emperor with a sword at a dinner party. He had survived wars, conspiracies, and palace coups for 2 decades. In the end, it was a deer that finished him. A large stag appeared in a clearing ahead of him. Basil charged toward it on horseback. The stag turned at the last moment and its antlers caught in the emperor's belt. The animal bolted and dragged Basil for 16 miles through the forest. His attendants lost sight of him almost immediately. They found him alive but barely conscious, hanging from the stag's antlers, his body torn open by branches and undergrowth across the entire 16-mile track. He died from his injuries within days. Some historians suspect his attendants deliberately let the stag run. His son Leo VI, who despised him, became emperor immediately. The man who murdered his way to the Byzantine throne was killed by a deer. Sigurd the Mighty. In approximately 892 AD, Norse Earl Sigurd the Mighty rode home across the Scottish Highlands after defeating his enemy Mael Brigte of Moray in single combat. Sigurd had agreed to a 40-man per side battle, then showed up with 80. He won easily. He cut off Mael Brigte's head and strapped it to his saddle as a trophy for the ride home. It was the kind of gesture that made his reputation. It was also the last decision he ever made. Mael Brigte had a large bucktooth that protruded from his lower jaw. As Sigurd rode, the severed head bounced against his leg with each stride of the horse. The tooth scraped repeatedly against his calf. The scrape broke the skin. The wound turned infected within days. Sigurd's leg swelled, darkened, and the infection spread upward through his body. He died from blood poisoning, caused by the tooth of the man he had killed. He never made it back to his hall. Mael Brigte had the last word. Charles II of Navarre. In January 1387, 54-year-old Charles II of Navarre lay in his bed in Pamplona, sick and partially paralyzed, while his physician supervised a medicinal wrapping treatment. He was known as Charles the Bad, not as an insult but as his actual historical title, earned through decades of poisonings, betrayals, and political assassinations. His body was failing him, and his doctor had ordered him wrapped from head to toe in brandy-soaked cloth to stimulate his circulation. A servant finished wrapping Charles tightly in the linen. She needed to cut the excess cloth away. She held a candle close to see the threads. The candle touched the linen. The brandy-soaked cloth ignited instantly across his entire body. Charles was bound too tightly to move his arms. He burned alive in his own bed, unable to extinguish himself or cry out quickly enough to be saved. By the time attendants reached him, the damage was fatal. He died days later from his burns. Charles the Bad, who had survived a lifetime of political murder, was killed by his own doctor's prescription. Harold Hardrada. On 25 September 1066, 51-year-old Harold Hardrada stood in a field at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, his armor left behind at his ships 3 miles away. He was the King of Norway, the most feared warrior in Europe, and a veteran of campaigns stretching from Constantinople to the Arctic. He had invaded England with 300 ships and 9,000 men, and stood waiting in a linen shirt. King Harold of England arrived at a full gallop with an army that had marched 185 miles in 4 days. Harold formed a shield wall. The English offered him terms: 7 feet of English ground, or a little more, since he is taller than other men. Harold refused. An arrow struck him in the throat. He fell in the front rank of his own shield wall. When the battle finally ended, the 300 ships that had carried his invasion force needed only 24 to carry the survivors home. 3 days later, William of Normandy landed in the south. The conqueror of half the known world ended his career in a field without his armor, killed by a single arrow he never saw coming.